Good evening, everyone. I am Diver Dave, and we are sitting back in the 613 Dive Lab, of course. And I would say I have coffee, but it is 9 o'clock at night, so we're kind of cheating. And we've just got a little bit of water going on, but we can raise the coffee cups and say cheers, because here in Ottawa, Ontario, it was a nice spring day, and that means dive season is just around the corner. So that is pretty cool. I've got a pretty packed agenda tonight. I'm about to try to do more material than I've ever done live, and this should be pretty interesting. So please bear with me as we go through it all. We've got, before we get into the agenda, I always like to say 613 Dive. I am a PADI Master Scuba Diver Trainer Instructor here in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. I do most of my diving and teaching about an hour away in the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River, for those that don't know, is an absolute diving playground in terms of getting experience and just being a really, really great place to dive. I've dove there for about 6 years now, and most of my experience is in the St. Lawrence River, and it is a world-class playground in terms of teaching you to be a good diver. So for those who have not dove in the St. Lawrence, I would highly encourage you to give it a try. And for those who have, of course, dive season is just around the corner. So we've got, like I said, a lot of topics tonight to try to get through. It should be interesting to see if I can get through it all. And first things up is we're going to talk about a quick review on the Gas Blender course that I took at Canada Diving Supply last Sunday. So I will talk a bit about that. We're going to do a dive gear discussion and talk about the Venture heated vest for cold water divers, in case you're thinking about buying one. We have a dive toolbox section that'll go over the Nitrox analyzer and why I feel that if you're an Enriched Air diver, a Nitrox analyzer should be part of your dive toolkit. We're going to then get into the long hose discussion. That's a good one. This one I actually didn't think about, and shout out to T-Hoy T3 for asking the question on the YouTube channel today. And it sort of made me think, hey, I should put that in the podcast as a bit of a section here. So looking forward to talking about that one. We'll talk about, very briefly, some of the videos that I released over the last week. If we get anyone on the chat, of course, we'll take a Q&A session. I'm always happy to take questions. We've got a kind of a fun story that I will sort of save for the last bit. And then, of course, we'll talk about the outro. So let's get to the top of the list, and we'll go from there. And by the way, I've got like 3 cameras going on today, so I'm going to have to figure out how to switch between them all. My iPhone, the second camera. Let's see how it works. All right, dive course review. I wanted to take a quick minute to talk about the PADI Gas Blender course that I took on Sunday with Jeff Horrocks, the instructor at Canada Diving Supply. Jeff is the owner of Canada Diving Supply, and it was myself, Scott Miller, Devin, and of course, Mr. Chris taking the course with Jeff. Overall, it was a great course. There were some things that I already knew because I had a chance to learn about that a bit earlier. But the one thing I really, really enjoyed was being able to take a valve, a scuba valve or a tank valve, and completely rip it apart and hit it with a service kit, and then be able to build it all back, make sure it was O2 cleaned, and get it back to the part where it's actually working. So I had never taken a valve apart before. And so that was actually a really good experience to actually go through. There is a lot of work that's needed in order to rebuild a valve with a service kit. So for those, when you're taking your gear in and you're getting like one of your valves rebuilt, trust me, there's a fair bit of work involved there to sort of make that happen. The next part of the course was teaching us how to O2 clean a tank. And so luckily, Chris had a tank that he needed to actually get O2 cleaned. And so that required us actually taking a look inside, doing a VIP or a visual inspection, and then actually putting it on the tumbler with some steel or some ferrite beads to actually get the rust out of it. That is a painstaking process. So again, if you are getting your tank tumbled in one of the dive shops, I'm telling you, the behind-the-scene work to make all that happen, it's a lot of work. Typically, a tank will tumble for about an hour on the tumbler machine, and then getting the beads out, I'm just going to say it is a real pain in the ass. So that was really good to go through. I had actually done that before on my own tank, so I was kind of familiar with the process. But again, really good part of the course. And then the last piece, which is the one I was really interested in, was learning how to actually make my own enriched air blends. So anything up to 40%. So we were using the, basically O2 and the gas booster, and then learning how to blend it all to sort of come out and use the, get all the calculations to sort of get it right. That's actually really handy to know. And it sounds like we may be having, or we may have the opportunity to help out with the shop and do some blends as the demand rises. So happy to help there. Overall, final thoughts on the gas course. For me, I got everything I needed out of that course. Jeff, I thought, did an extremely good job of keeping it very hands-on. There was no death by PowerPoint. Everything was, like I said, very practical. We got to physically build all the valves. We got to tumble the tanks. We got to do all the gas blending. So overall, like I said, great job, Jeff. And I really, really enjoyed that course. If you have any interest in becoming a gas blender, I would say, and you're local, reach out to KDS, talk to Jeff, and I'm sure he'd be happy to get you signed up. Okay, we got through that one. All right, up next is a dive gear discussion, and we're going to focus on the Venture heated vest. So the Venture heated vest is something that I bought way back last spring in 2024, and I've got probably about 250 dives on it by now. So I feel like I've had enough experience where I could sort of give some feedback. Number one is, why did I buy it? Well, the water is pretty cold in here in the springtime and the early summers and then fall, and then, of course, the wintertime. And so the Venture heated vest does, I think, a very good job of giving you some heat across the chest and the back area. It doesn't come with heated glove options, but it at least gives you a way of actually giving you some heat inside your dry suit or wetsuit, by the way. But for me, it's all dry suit, and allowing you to use it inside your dry suit sort of provide you some additional heat, which for me allowed me to reduce the amount of layers that I was diving with as the water got colder. The Venture heated vest, I have it hanging here. All right. It actually has a very easy way to get in. You can either just zip it off, all right, and then zip it back on when you're wearing it like a vest. I literally just keep the zipper closed and I just pull it over, just kind of like a hoodie. It has the ability to have 2 battery packs, 1 on each side. Okay. And then the cool part is it's wirelessly controlled. Wirelessly controlled. And I'll give you a close-up shot here in a sec. And then it allows you to use and turn it on and off, and there's 3 levels of heat through a remote wrist control that you could wear on the outside of your dry suit. That is a very nice feature and is very handy. Okay. So I'm just going to take a quick moment to actually put the batteries in. So give me 1 sec. And I probably should hand over to the iPhone cam. So let's do that. We'll get that out of the way. All right. So we'll put 1 of the batteries in. They come with 2 of these batteries. I've dove for 2 hours on these batteries at the middle heat setting, and I've had no issues. So we're going to just connect that in, screw that in like that. We'll turn it on. This one still needs to be charged, but it has enough just for the demo. You can secure that. And now we can flip over to this one and put that one in. I'll turn that on. This one's fully charged. You can see by the lights. And the cool part is now we can get that showing. So now we have the wrist remote, all right? And you can see here that this is off. If I hold this down, long press it, Now you can see that it's on level 1. And if I wanted to go to level 2 heat, you can see I get level 2 heat. And now if I wanted to go to level 3, and if you can feel it. So the cool part is you get the lights. Of course, you can't see the lights because it's inside a dry suit, but you can get the vibration. And you can feel the vibration even through the layers that you have on underneath your dry suit. So that's pretty nice. And then to simply turn it off is just a long hold. And now the vest is off. So that is very, very nice in terms of being able to put that on my wrist. All right. And now I can essentially, let me see if I can get that in the camera. Right. And now I can control everything I need. So I've been in 34-degree Fahrenheit water, and usually for the most part, I'm on setting number 2. Let's get back to the other mic. And we'll come back over here. So all that to say is the Venture heated vest for me was a really, really good investment. And in fact, I bought one for Reese at the end of the season as well, because he was starting to get a bit cold on his dives. It is well made. It comes with an additional sort of extended panel in case you needed a little bit more room. I don't really feel the bulk of the batteries inside the dry suit, to be honest, so it kind of disappears once you've got it all on. But let's take a little bit of a minute to talk about the ups and downs of actually using the vest. So let's talk about cost. That Venture heated vest is going to run you somewhere in between $1,100 Canadian. Now, to those who don't own a heated vest that works underwater, that sounds expensive. But if you compare it to a full heated system that, full undergarments with the heated gloves, that's going to run you with the external battery pack somewhere in between the $2,000 to $3,000 range. So the $1,100 investment for at least heat just through the chest and the back is worth it if you don't want to spend the extra dollars on the full system. Okay. Like I said, I've got about 250 dives on mine now. I've had 0 issues, 0 problems. The thing is rock solid and it just works. The one thing I wanted to actually share, not that I use it for that, it'll also work with wetsuits. So it is fully waterproof. The batteries are completely sealed, and so there's no real worry about having to or damaging it if it got wet. I wanted to take a quick moment to talk about the pluses and the minuses. So some would say that a disadvantage is that the battery is internal to the dry suit. So if at the remote chance you had a battery fire, the fire is actually contained inside the dry suit, and it would be very hard for you to sort of deal with that. I believe that. That's certainly a bit of a risk that you take on diving with this kind of vest. Having said that, these battery packs are triple sealed. I mean, the technology's been around for a long time, and I have yet to find an incident where one of these batteries actually kind of went on fire. So for me, the risk was worth it. Now, I mentioned this before. If I was doing long decompression dives and I was relying on some sort of heated system, I would probably go to an external battery pack and an undergarment where I could actually control the battery from the external side. But for me, I'm using these vests mostly to dive in their practice type dives, and I'm not doing any sort of big dives by the time I'm in some super cold water. So for me, the Venture heated vest is a perfect solution. And like I said, there's a lack of a heated glove option. So if you're one who tends to get cold hands while you're diving in your dry suit and dry gloves, there is no heated option at the moment. That would be a really nice plus if at some point they came up with a way of putting in some heated glove system. Okay. The pluses, I would say, is, of course, cost versus a full undergarment heated system. We've just talked about that. The wrist remote is really, really flexible and convenient. That is very nice to do. Ease of install. I mean, it doesn't really get much easier than that. With a complete heated undergarment system, you've got wires going through the dry suit inflator valve. There's all sorts of stuff, wires going down the arms. There's all sorts of stuff going on. This is very, very easy. And the last thing, like I said, is it's you can also use it in a wetsuit. So that's very convenient. Okay, I did want to quickly talk about using a heated system while diving because this was something that I didn't think about until I started to look into it, and so I wanted to share it. So give me a second to get this on the screen. And we'll get that up and running, and we'll switch over to this. All right. So as I was doing some investigation in terms of just using a heated system for diving, and while we know that decompression is all still a bit of a black science and a bit of a, there's a lot going on that we still don't understand. One of the things that we do kind of understand is that thermal status, the amount of thermal stress we're under during a dive, really does sort of make a difference in terms of managing our DCS risk, our decompression sickness risk. And so thermal status is the only thing I really wanted to touch on here. I'm not going to get into the rest of this stuff, but there's a lot there. But the thermal status, and I wanted to talk about using a heated vest or a heated system in the best way possible in terms of reducing your risk. And so if we just sort of talk about the scenarios in terms of what this means, the worst scenario in terms of DCS risk would be to use a heated vest all the way down, all the way during the deepest part of your dive, and then you turn it off for your ascent and then your safety stop. And the reason is blood flow. If you're nice and warm as you start to descend down to the deepest part of your dive, your blood vessels are opening up and you're allowing blood flow, and then you're increasing or making the, onboarding of nitrogen more efficient. All right. And then the vice versa is also true. If now you're ascending and now you're super cold, you've turned your vest off. Now the blood vessels are restricting. Now the off-gassing of nitrogen is now slowed down. It's not very efficient. And so you really start to increase the chance of your off-gassing and risk of DCS. The best way to use it would be, stay cold at the bottom portion of your dive. Blood vessels are restricted, slowing down the onboarding of nitrogen, and then turn the heated vest on as you're ascending and your safety stop. Now your blood flow is a little bit better. The off-gassing of nitrogen is much more efficient, and so now reducing the risk of DCS. So the scenario you'd have to really think about is if you turn, because you're diving in cold water, this is why you have a vest. If you are turning this vest on all the way down during the deepest part of your dive, and then you're thinking, well, I'm also going to keep it on the way up, but the vest breaks. Let's say it runs out of battery, whatever reason it is. Now you actually have used it all the way through the deepest part of your dive, but you no longer have it for the ascent and the safety stop. This is the worst probable scenario for potentially increasing your DCS risk. So I just wanted to put that out there in terms of if you're going to dive with a heated vest or a heated system, something to keep in mind. So that's the disclaimer. Final thoughts on the heated vest. And I always ask this question when folks tell me they either went on vacation or they bought. I said, would you buy it again? Would you go there again? So would I buy this again? And the answer is absolutely. For the type of cold water diving that I'm doing, which are not big dives, I absolutely love the Venture heated vest. And in fact, I did buy it again because I bought one for Reese and he also loves it. So I have nothing but great things to say about the Venture heated vest. I bought both of mine, right? I didn't get any demos or any of that stuff. It's just a good product. I feel like it worked well. I've got enough time on it and dives on it to say that it has so far worked or worked as advertised. I guess that's the words I'm looking for. All right, so let's talk about the dive toolbox must-have. And if you are an Enriched Air diver, then I'm going to say up next is we're going to talk about the things that you should have in your dive toolbox. Number one is going to be your own Nitrox analyzer. And then, of course, with that comes some sort of tape to mark your tank. And then, of course, a marker to actually mark the tape to mark your tank. All right. I know this sounds pretty simple, but you'd be pretty surprised in terms of really the folks who really don't own their own analyzers. So let's talk a little bit about the why. I'll get this up. So the first thing I'll talk about, in case you're a new diver, is PADI has an Enriched Air diver certification, and we can quickly talk about why would you even consider taking the Enriched Air diver certification. So number one is it'll extend your no decompression limits. Okay. The second point I have here is reduced nitrogen absorption. So that means it probably could lower your DCS risk. And the reason is because you're running a lower blend of nitrogen and more oxygen, then of course you should be lowering the potential of DCS risks due to nitrogen on-gassing. The third point I have is safer repetitive diving. So if you're doing a multi-dive day, like, you've got 2 dives to do on a charter, maybe you're doing 4 dives in one day, it happens. Definitely running a Nitrox blend should help make that safer, because again, it's reducing you to, it's reducing your exposure to nitrogen. And the last point I'll say is less fatigue post-dive. I've heard this 8 million times. Now, I've looked and looked and looked, and there is no research actually to back this up. So, but I have heard this a lot. My own experience running and diving a lot with ENX 32, 36, 28, you name it, is I don't feel any different after a dive running an Enriched Air mix. But I know people who swear by it, so I don't know. But I do know that there is no scientific proof to actually support that claim. All right. So let's talk about why, if you are an Enriched Air diver, you should have your own analyzer, tape, and marker. And I'm just going to give you some real world examples. So I was on a dive trip, and the dive resort had EANX 32 blend on tap, which meant you grab your tank and it's already filled. When they fill the tank, it's filled with 32%. I would always take a few minutes to use my analyzer just to double check, and mark and label the tank to make sure that I knew that what I was diving, I measured it. And so, to be fair to the dive resort, it always came out at 32%. So I'm not going to say I found any mixes that were off, but at the same time, it would just give me some peace of mind to know that what I'm diving, I've measured, and I'm confident that my computer is now set to what's in the tank. What I noticed with the group of divers as the week sort of progressed is some people started to measure their tanks, and then what happened is the Nitrox analyzer broke that the resort was providing, and everyone just kind of went away from it. And so if you had your own Nitrox analyzer with you, of course, you could just use it like the way I was using it to measure your own tanks. And that way it just kind of gives you peace of mind, and it kind of keeps you on the adhering to the protocol of measuring your own tanks before you dive with it. So that was kind of the real world example number one. The next thing I noticed that we were on the charter boat was most folks, because they ran out of the green tape at the dive shop, that we just stopped marking our tanks. And so things like the mix and the MOD, the maximum operating depth, we just kind of gave up on that. So again, if you have your own tape and your own marker and your own analyzer, you don't really care what the dive shop has, because you can take care of yourself. And so that's sort of a pattern that I noticed over the course of that week. And then I also noticed that we had a very small mix of non-Enriched Air divers on the boat. And so now I have this mix of 32% tanks, but they are not marked. And I have divers on there who also have 21%. So really, it would be pretty easy to start mixing up tanks if you're not careful. And then the last piece to that real world example was we came back to the dock for before dive number 2 on the charter boat, and they just let everyone keep their tanks on their BCDs, and then they used a long fill whip from the dock to sort of refill all the tanks with 32% that they had on bank. And then people would come back, they would get all their tanks, they would just basically put their yoke or their DIN first stages back on, and then we go off diving. And to me, again, I was like, nobody really took the time to, sort of reanalyze it just to make sure that their tanks had 32% in them. So again, having your own Nitrox analyzer, your tape, your marker really just sort of puts all of that away because you can just take care of yourself. I always like to teach to my students, you are the only one responsible for your dive safety. Do not rely on anyone else. And I wanted to get into a little bit of a Nitrox example for those that don't know. And I wanted to give another example in terms of a real world question that I was hoping that maybe folks could put into the chat or even on the comments once the video is posted. And this is also a real world question that I have seen a couple years back. So you and your buddy decide to do a charter dive. And at the last minute, your buddy has to bow out. You're on the dock, like you want to go diving. And so what they offer up is, hey, you can join the dive group that's also on the charter boat with you. So that's what you do. Are you going to take the time, or I guess I should say you should take the time now that you're planning to dive with a new group, is take the time to understand what's the dive plan. That's number one. The second thing is, who am I budding up with? How much experience do they have? Of course, because as we all know, buddies are important. And then the last piece of that is what blend are they using? Are they all diving air, or are they all diving like 32%, maybe 36%? That is a pretty important question, because let's say you and your buddy had just planned to dive 21%. Let's say you've got 2 tanks with you for 2 dives on the charter boat. Both of your tanks are 21%, but now you're going to dive with a group that's all diving 32%. And the questions I have now is, would there be anything to be concerned about in that scenario for you? What would be the risks, and how would you plan the dive? Would you even dive, by the way, or would you just abort? And if you decided to dive, how would you plan it? And I'd love to see comments and also some feedback in the posts as I get the video up. And then what I'll do is I'll try and tackle the feedback on the next podcast. And then the last bit to the Nitrox piece is I have a couple of examples that I wanted to share. So I'll bring this up on the screen. So air versus Nitrox, just for those who are new to this Nitrox game. If you did a dive just on 21%, so air, at 60 feet, the dive tables, and I'm just going with dive tables right now, the dive tables say that your no decompression limit is essentially 55 minutes. And if you did the same dive on EANX 32 or 32% Nitrox, depth 60 feet, your no decompression limits actually bump up to 90 minutes. So you get 35 additional minutes. Now, there's a big asterisk there. We're going to talk about that in a sec. Because the gas planning and the rule of thirds still have to apply regardless of what blend you're running. And then if you did a dive to 80 feet for 30 minutes on air, 21%, your NDL is 30 minutes at 80 feet. And the same thing for 32%, 80 feet, you actually gain another 15 minutes. So your NDL limits now go increase to 45 minutes. So the last question I'm going to ask you guys on the Nitrox piece is, if you just thought about it from a pure gas plan perspective, all right, let's not think about anything else in terms of the advantages. But does EANX 32 offer any additional value for a charter dive to 60 feet? And I'd love to hear your thoughts either in the chat, but we don't have anyone on the chat, or in the comments if you're watching this after the fact. And then the next question I'd ask on that is, what would be the advantages of using EANX 32 or Nitrox 32 for a charter dive at 60 feet? And I would be curious to hear what you guys have to say. So we've gone through a lot. I'm going to take a minute break, and I'll be right back. Okay, so we've gotten through the venture heated vest. We've gotten through the Nitrox sort of portion of the podcast. And now we're going to talk about the long hose discussion. And so I wanted to this was a question that came up from T-Hoy T3 in the comment section of one of the YouTube self-reliant videos. So appreciate that. Thank you for watching and thank you for asking the question. And his question was, hey, do I need to run a long hose on my pony tank, my 40 cubic foot pony tank? And I said, well, you know what? That's a great question. And I'm going to tackle that one in the podcast tonight. But then I said, hey, let's just talk about the long hose in particular, because some folks, I'm sure, don't even understand what is even the long hose in terms of scuba diving. So the long hose is a concept. It's a 5 foot or 7 foot regulator hose on your primary. All right. So I'm breathing out from a 7 foot hose. It is routed accordingly around my body so that I can tuck it away and store it safely. But really, it's a concept that came up, I think, in the 70s and 80s from the U.S. cave diving folks. They needed a way of being able to share air easily in single file, coming out and exiting a cave, but still being able to share air. So they came up with this concept of the 7 foot hose that really allowed some distance. And so what I wanted to do is quickly go over some advantages and disadvantages of a long hose and why it's important. So number one advantage would be effective gas sharing, because now if I have a panic diver coming at me, I can actually deploy my long hose. I can get them breathing to it. I'm breathing from my secondary that's around my neck from a necklace. And then once they sort of settle down, I can really deploy the 7 foot length of the hose. And now they're 7 feet away from me breathing until they calm down, versus the short yellow octo hose, which is they're kind of in my sort of space. So that 7 foot hose really allows me to sort of push that panic diver away, but also allow me to give them the air that they need. Back in the cave or some wreck diving, back in those days, they came up with a way because they needed to sort of single file share air, like I mentioned, in an overhead environment. And then, of course, again, diver safety in an out of air scenario. If you have a panic diver, it really allows you to sort of give them the air, but also keep them away sort of from within your safety circle. The disadvantages in the recreational side, because this is part of the tech training. If you start to do any sort of tech training, the long hose will definitely be part of that training. But in the recreational side of diving, the disadvantage could be it's kind of overwhelming for new divers. Now you've got this additional long hose that you've got to figure out and how to route properly. So you have to be careful there. It certainly works best with a backplate wing. So you have to keep that in mind. It might be difficult to manage as a new diver trying to figure it all out. And then, like I said, it requires proper hose routing. So all that to say is there are some major advantages in running a 7 foot hose, and there's some disadvantages if you're thinking about doing it in a recreational side. So then I would ask, well, who needs one? Like I said, everyone in the tech space, you go into a tech course, that's one of the first things you're going to learn is how to dive with a long hose. The recreational side, I've dove with a long hose a fair bit. As a dive master, I would use a long hose. If I'm a dive master on a charter guide, I would definitely have a long hose, because then if I have some sort of out of air scenario, it's going to be real easy for me to share air. Self-reliant diver, is it necessary? It's not necessary. It's not part of the course, but it certainly is. By the time you're getting to become a self-reliant diver, you're getting to the cusp of recreational diving. And so it certainly could be an area that you should try and sort of gain some experience, because the next step might be you're heading to the tech world anyway. And so if you go into the tech diving training already familiar with the long hose, that is probably going to help. And now we get to the question from T-Hoy T3, which was, Dave, I watched the self-reliant stuff. Would I actually put a long hose on my pony tank? And I wanted to quickly talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of doing that. And I've got a couple pony tanks actually set up over here, and I wanted to briefly discuss it and go through why I actually moved away from putting a long hose on my 40 cubic foot pony tank and went back just to a regular length regulator hose. So give me a sec and I'll get that set up and we'll go from there. So we should be back. And now I get to get up and move around. So that's kind of cool. So I've got three, what I would call, well, at least two pony tanks. And then I would call the last one here a stage. All right. We'll start with this one. This one is Reese's. And hey, look at this. Actually, this one is mine. So good job on me. I've labeled it 21% with the MOD. And so I like to see that. This one has a normal regulator length hose on it. And I've also gone a little bit extra and put a, what I would call either a BCD low pressure inflator hose, which is really good for inflating my SMB, or I could actually use it in case I had some sort of dry suit hose malfunction while I'm diving. Then I could use this as a bit of a backup. But as you can see from a hose routing perspective, this would be very easy to stow away and very easy to deploy. It's very quick. All right, so that I like that. And really the intent here is if I had a buddy who was out of air, the first thing I would do would be, deploy. I would deploy the regulator. I get them breathing on the reg. Once they've calmed down, everything's okay, they've given me the okay sign, then I would then figure out how would I clip the pony tank onto his BCD. And like I mentioned in the last podcast in terms of being a self-reliant diver, if you're going to be diving with a pony tank and you're diving with a buddy who does not have a pony tank, probably a good move before the dive starts is to do a bit of a pre-dive check and say, hey, if I had to help you in an out-of-air scenario, how would I actually clip this onto your BCD? And then start to figure out where all the D-rings are so that you can sort of figure that out before you're actually in the out-of-air scenario. All right. The next one is, Reese also had a short regulator hose on his, but I kind of modified it today just for the video. And you can see, you can run a 7-foot hose, okay, on a 40 cubic foot pony tank, and you can do it reasonably well. All right. And if you deployed that hose, it's a bit more of a pain to get out. All right. As you can see. But all that to say is I now have 7 foot of hose to deploy and get that to my buddy. Now that to me took quite a while to do. And so it's one of the reasons why I actually don't like diving with a 7-foot hose on the 40 cubic foot tank. So for me, I went back to this setup. All right, but I just wanted to show that it is possible to route a 7-foot hose on the pony tank. But I would really try to get them breathing off the short hose first and then figure out a way to get it actually deployed onto their dive kit. And the last example I will just give, because this is a bit more on the technical side, is I have an 80 cubic foot cylinder here. I call this my stage. It's actually my bailout stage for my CCR. And you can see it absolutely has a 7-foot hose on it, okay? And this is, obviously in an emergency, I would deploy that to a buddy. It's a little easier to deploy because of the way it's set up and the fact that it's a little bit wider of a tank, so the radiuses are a little bit easier on the hose. The setup is very similar. I still have a BCD hose or a dry suit hose that I can use for a SMB deployment if I had to. And then on this one, it has actually an extra QC6 connector because I could patch this into my CCR loop. So this would be much more of a technical setup. But again, you would certainly have the 7-foot hose on that. So T-Hoy T3, I hope that helps. I personally like to stick to the shorter regulator hose on the 40 cubic foot, but there's nothing wrong with going to a 7-foot hose. But chances are, if I'm diving with a 40 cubic foot tank as my pony, I already have a 7-foot hose as my primary on my dive kit. And if I had a buddy who was out of air, I most likely would deploy that to him or them while I'm starting to figure out how to get them on the pony tank. So I hope that helps. Okay, we got through the pony tank discussion. I mean, that's kind of cool. Let's talk a little bit about 613 dive videos. We we've been releasing quite a few videos the last little while. You can tell I'm not diving a whole lot. So we had new diver fail, check your tank valve. So I did that one early this week, or late last week, actually. I also put out a learning to scuba dive for any of the new divers who are trying to understand what is the open water certification journey like. I put out a pretty cool father and son video that I really enjoyed making because it really showed Reese's progress over the last dive season back in 2024. And, you know, that video was all about now him sort of that graduation dive where he was leading me on a much larger square sort of technical dive. And he did awesome. So that was pretty good. And I would hold off on a few minutes right now if we had anyone on the chat. But of course, we still don't have the chat, which means we're still not there yet. But we do have a pretty cool story that I kind of posted on the Facebook group, and this was the Aussie Land Cruiser story. So for those that did not see the link, I'm going to play the video here for 2 minutes. But this is a group of Aussies who decided to electrify a 1978 Toyota Land Cruiser. So they basically ripped this thing apart. They made it all electric. And then they came up with this idea of like, you know what we should do is we should take this thing, electrify it, and then drive the damn thing underwater for 7 kilometers across the bay across the harbor down in Australia. And I'm like, how does that conversation even start? That you know there's got to be some alcohol involved. That you know that. And so if you think about it, these guys, they took this 78 Land Cruiser, they electrified it, and they thought they were going to drive this thing 7 kilometers underwater. Now, of course, they did this with a team of 30 divers, all taking turns. I guess they must have been descending down and then ascending back up. And it ended up taking way longer than they thought. It was a massive silk cloud by some of the video you could see. And I just love the fact that it's just such a fun video to watch. I mean, I feel like, you know, if the world was ran more by like folks from Newfoundland and Aussies, we'd probably be in a better place, man, because it's always fun. I've never had a bad experience talking to an Aussie or someone from Newfoundland. I can tell you that. That's for sure. So I'm going to take a sec. I'm going to get the video up online and we'll go from there. Let's see if we can get her going. We'll get over to here. Back up to that. And here we go.
A bizarre sight that seemed impossible. A 1978 Land Cruiser descends into Darwin Harbour. The high-stakes mission dreamed up by a group of mates over a couple of beers.
The world record we're going for is the furthest distance driven underwater by a car and the deepest depth driven underwater by a car.
Journeying 7 kilometres across the harbour and 30 metres deep, a trip first attempted unsuccessfully 40 years ago.
This is like an urban myth in Darwin when they did this 40 years ago, and I grew up listening to stories, and it almost faded into mythology.
Inspiring the months-long mission to transform a second-hand car from unroadworthy to seaworthy. The vehicle tested in salt water just once.
So you just got to act like it's another day in the office and just get the job done. It's really how I'm thinking about it.
30 commercial drivers flown in from across Australia, taking turns behind the wheel in murky waters home to sharks and crocodiles.
I'm pretty sure a bright orange car coming towards a shark or a croc that I've never seen before aren't going to be hanging around at all.
Mud and silt proved the biggest threats. The car bogged several times and taking 2 hours to clear an underwater gas pipeline. We've come out onto the water to track the car's journey across the Darwin Harbour. It's now more than 30 metres below the surface, meaning we can't see it at all. Just a boat over here connecting it to the world above. Crowds hoped for a glimpse of its arrival with bated breath.
It doesn't sound promising if they're only halfway.
Meant to be all over by 4 o'clock, but as the sun set, the car nowhere to be seen. Finally, around 9 o'clock, the team is surfacing to hundreds of cheers. Barramundi thrust high in the air in success. 5 hours late, but still smiling. Lillian Rengia, ABC News.
I mean, how cool does that story get? I mean, I've done some cool dives in my time. But I mean, driving a 78 Land Cruiser that's electric at 30 meters underwater, I mean, that's That's about as cool as it gets. That's a pretty big cool factor right there. But I would love to talk to these guys. Man, how did you guys come up with this one? Because that's got to be some funny stories there. And like they're going in with single tanks on their back, 30 meters. I mean, this is not a small dive. I mean, I thought this thing was going to be like, 10, 12 feet. No. This is like 100-foot dive for 7 kilometers. I mean, there's some major logistics here to figure this thing out. And, I love the fact that they're talking about sharks and crocodiles. I mean, yeah, no doubt, probably no shark, no crocodile want to be part of that at all. And then the guy holding up the fish at the end, I'm like, first of all, where in the hell did the fish come from? So anyway, that's a pretty cool story. I really chuckled when I saw it. And so I thought I would share that on the Facebook group. And then, of course, wanted to talk about it on the podcast. So cool story. All right. So that's pretty much what we got on for this evening's podcast. So I feel like I made it all the way through, got all the content that I wanted to chat about out. So that's pretty nice. You know what? YouTube, I'm still battling the algorithm. I'll tell you that right now. It is such a huge learning curve. The cool part is that I've also now spun up a Spotify podcast channel so that if you are on the Spotify app and if you do a search for 613 Dive, you will now see all of our videos show up on the podcast inside the Spotify app. So that's pretty nice. I would say the way I grow in terms of the 613 Dive YouTube channel is through likes, comments, and then of course subscriptions, but only if you feel the content has delivered. And so that's what I feel like, that part is up to me. Feedback is always cool. I've had a few folks reach out with some suggestions and sort of how to tweak things a little bit. I want to let you guys know that's much appreciated, of course. And honestly, for all the subscribers, we still keep growing every day. I just wanted to say a huge thanks. Thank you for taking the time to hit the subscribe button. Thank you for taking the time to do all the video watching and the comments. It is so appreciated. And practice hard, dive safe.